It was a typical Friday evening, unremarkable at first. My husband of 15 years, Dan, walked to the front door, loosening his tie and giving me the familiar, warm smile I had grown so used to. "Hey, Claire," he greeted, setting his briefcase down beside the couch. "I ran into Alan at work today. He invited us over for dinner tomorrow." Alan, Dan's co-worker, was a sharp, self-assured man in his mid-40s. I'd only encountered him a few times during company events, but he always left an impression. There was a quiet command in the way he carried himself, as though he didn't need to say much to capture a room's attention. A casual dinner at his place didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. I nodded, offering a smile. "Sure, sounds nice. Want me to bring something?" The following day, I noticed myself fussing over the details more than I normally would. I'd picked out a deep navy dress, the one Dan always said made my eyes stand out, and spent extra time curling my hair. I wasn't sure why I cared so much, but there was something about this dinner that felt different. Alan's house was a reflection of him, sleek, modern, and meticulously arranged. The clean architecture, the ambient lighting, and the subtle scent of lavender in the air gave it the feel of something straight from a high-end magazine. He greeted us with warmth, his handshake confident, but lingering just a second longer than expected. Throughout the evening, Alan's effortless charm was on full display. He chuckled at Dan's stories, offered his own engaging anecdotes, and kept the conversation fluid and lively. Still, I couldn't help but notice how his eyes kept meeting mine, more often than seemed necessary. It wasn't obvious or inappropriate, but each glance made my pulse quicken slightly. At one point, Dan stepped outside to take a phone call, and Alan didn't miss a beat. "You know," he said, his tone softer and more intimate than before, "Dan's a lucky man. You're truly something, Claire." The compliment caught me off guard. I responded with a courteous smile, tried to brush it off, but inside, something fluttered, something I hadn't felt in years. The days that followed were oddly quiet. Dan didn't bring up Alan, and I didn't ask. Still, my thoughts kept circling back to that evening. His gaze, his words, they lingered in my mind like a song you couldn't shake. Then, out of nowhere, Alan called. "Hi, Claire," he said casually, though his confidence came through clearly. "Dan mentioned you're great at organizing events. I'm putting together a small client gathering next week and could really use your help." I paused. Was this strictly business or something else? "Sure," I replied cautiously. "I'd be happy to help." What began as a simple favor soon turned into regular visits to Alan's house. At first, it was all about logistics, picking decor, reviewing catering options, but gradually, the nature of our conversations began to shift. Alan had this way of really listening, of asking about my interests and aspirations, topics Dan hadn't touched on in ages. One evening, while we were reviewing the seating arrangements of the event, he leaned in a little closer. "Claire," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can just be myself with you," Alan said, his voice low and deliberate. "That's something I don't find often." His words hung between us, dense with unspoken meaning. A wave of guilt swept over me, but beneath it, undeniably, was a spark of excitement, something I hadn't felt in far too long. "Alan," I began, doing my best to keep my voice steady, "you're easy to talk to, but I'm married." "I know," he said, his gaze locked on mine, "and I respect that, but I'd be lying if I pretended this connection wasn't real." The night of Alan's client gathering marked a shift, one I hadn't been ready for, but couldn't ignore. I arrived ahead of time to help with the final touches. I wore a form-fitting black dress, the one Alan had complimented earlier that week. Everything went smoothly. His clients were clearly impressed, and the evening unfolded without a hitch. But when the last guest stepped out the door, the atmosphere changed. Alan poured us each a glass of wine, his eyes lingering on me as he handed it over. "To a successful evening," he said warmly. "To teamwork," I replied, trying to keep the mood light, but the look in his eyes made it nearly impossible to stay composed. We sank into the couch, the room dimly lit by the soft flicker of candlelight. "Claire," he said quietly, his tone now serious, "I don't want to make your life harder, but I can't keep this in any more. You've stirred something in me I thought had faded long ago. My heart pounded as his words sank in. Alan, this isn't fair. Not to me. Not to Dan. Not to anyone. I said, though my voice trembled, betraying my own uncertainty. I know, he whispered, reaching for my hand. His touch sent a rush of sensation through me, electric, undeniable. But you deserve to feel alive, to feel seen. Tears welled in my eyes. What he said pierced deeper than I expected, because somewhere in it was the truth I'd been avoiding. My marriage to Dan had become comfortable, yes, but in that comfort, something vital had faded. Alan's attention rekindled a sense of being desired, appreciated, and that feeling was intoxicating. In that moment, a choice sat before me. I could step away, pretend nothing ever happened, and return to the familiar rhythm of my life. Or I could admit what was real between Alan and me and venture into the unknown, risking everything for a chance at rediscovery. In the weeks that followed, I made choices I never imagined I'd face. I sat down with Dan and opened up about everything. About the distance that had grown between us, about the way I'd been feeling. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. But it needed to happen. Alan's honesty had forced me to confront the parts of myself I had long ignored. He didn't just disrupt my world. He challenged me to face it. We stayed in contact, Alan and I, and with time, our bond only deepened. It wasn't some picture-perfect fantasy. It was messy, uncertain, and completely real, but it was filled with possibility. Sometimes, life takes an unexpected turn, and it's in those detours that we rediscover parts of ourselves we thought were lost forever. And for that, for the awakening, I'd always carry a quiet gratitude.